Good morning, everyone. As you can see, there's a new background today, and until you'll send me some ideas for a new background, that's probably going to be still my responsibility. I'll try to keep up, but I'm going to run out of ideas soon, so please help me, send me some ideas. I want to start today. Let's put this on. Today we talk about the second part of the theory construction topic, focusing a little bit more on some issues related to IR theories. Before we go into today's discussion, I will do just like I told you on the last lecture on Tuesday, start with a quick review. So today we actually have something to review. On Tuesday, we started our discussion about the basics of theory construction. I talked about the differences between a theory and history, historical evidence, how we actually use historical facts as evidence to test our theories. And one of the main differences, of course, is that theory should provide us with prediction regarding the future of that certain topic or phenomena that we're talking about, while history only provides us a descriptive explanation of an event that happened in the past. So that's one of the main differences in this case. I gave you some details about the components of theory, focusing mostly on the assumptions as a set of conditions that allow us to simplify reality as we try to explain it and then build our predictions. The importance of selecting assumptions and understanding that different assumptions can explain the same phenomena. For example, I talked about the neorealist assumption of unitary actors versus the bureaucratic theory's assumption of internal dynamics within government, how both of them can explain the same outcome, which was military expenditures. That was the example. Then we went a little bit more to talk about testing theories with empirical data. So for that, we have to talk about variables, what type of variables we're actually familiar with when you talk about a theory. So the dependent variable, what we need to measure, the independent variable, how we want to establish a causal relationship between the independent variables and the variables. And then I went on to the second part of the discussion to talk about different ways that we judge theory. So the first is, how do we use evidence to evaluate a theory, whether we want support, whether we find support for our theory, or we actually contradict the theory, the importance of evidence in this case. The important principles of logical consistency between different assumptions. Assumption cannot contradict, it has to logically lead to some kind of an outcome. And the concept of the concept of falsifiability. In order for a theory to fit with the scientific rules, with the scientific structure, it has to be able to detail the conditions under which our predictions are wrong. So we should be able to find those conditions and also to find some evidence to show that. Because if a theory is we cannot falsify our theory, that's not a theory, it's a belief. Remind you again the example of religious beliefs versus other types of actual theories. And the last point was the competing explanations. That's another criteria we use in order to test our theories, trying to find explanations which are stronger, more accurate than the existing theory. That's where the principle of wind walking was much more central. The idea behind the wind walking principle is that an existing theory will prevail as long as there's no new theory which is stronger and more accurate in this case. And the wind walking told us that it's very hard to actually change our acceptance of a new explanation, because we need to find a lot of evidence to support this new explanation. And it's very hard to change the way we think about some issues. So that means that we are not very likely to accept new theories. And that leads to why a lot of the IR in terms of behavior of policymakers and behavior of states is very much predictable. So that was the main topics that I talked about on Tuesday. If you have any questions, of course, you are more than welcome to send them to me or come join me in office hours throughout the week. Based on this discussion from Tuesday, I want to talk about our next part, which is levels of analysis. Before going into what exactly levels of analysis means, I want to just quickly reiterate, when we think about explaining some kind of issue, some kind of phenomena, some kind of series of events, or even if we're not talking about international relations, we're talking about domestic factors, we talk about other things in our social environment, We have some requirements that we want to get from our analytical model. So we want it to offer an accurate description and correlate as much as possible to one from reality. Wanted to be able to be valid, to offer us a capacity to explain the relationship between different factors for the phenomena that we're trying to study. And we also want it to be as simple as possible, in this case being parsimonious, reminding you that again. And lastly, it's going to be a model that offers reliable predictions. So we can think about how that this phenomenon we're talking about might happen in the future. So that's the basic requirement from an analytical model. A lot of them I talked on different aspects on Tuesday, but that's just to set the agenda in this case. Now, there are many ways we can study different issues. And the idea of social studies is that we can use this concept of level of analysis in order to explore multiple angles to study those events. So for example, if we want to study a topic such as countries setting trade barriers, we want to think about it from multiple angles and understand why do countries are likely or not likely to set trade barriers under certain conditions. So the level of analysis, that's exactly the concept that shows us we can think about different levels in which we study the issue at hand and explain it. So overall, there are two different types when we think about levels of analysis, and all the discussion from now on is based on mostly the single paper that we had for today, reading for today. So first is the macro level of analysis. The macro level of analysis focuses on the system. In order to explain the phenomena, we think about, again, coming back to the example of trade barriers, so we want to think about how the international system leads some of its members, some of its countries, to decide to engage in a policy of trade barriers. The macro level of analysis is mostly used and is based in social science by the discipline of economics. So that's one level of analysis. The other level is, of course, the micro level. The micro level focuses on the parts or the components of the system. So again, sitting with the same example of trade barriers, why do countries set trade barriers? This time we're focusing on the countries themselves, the components of the system, to explain that. But we'll go into more detailed examples in a few minutes. In terms, again, of social studies, in social science, sociology and psychology are the main disciplines that use the micro level of analysis. And that's, again, the opposite from the macro level of analysis. Okay, so what I will do now is I will follow a lot of what we had in Singer's paper and talk a little bit more in details about those two main levels of analysis, the macro and the micro levels of analysis. So the macro level of analysis is, now you see, it's the system, the international system. We are trying to explain some phenomena in the international politics by focusing on the factors that relate to the system itself. So how states behave towards one another and what are the conditions within the system that impacts those actions. The environment that we study, of course, is international system, and the actors are the state themselves. So if we want to think about, again, the example that I gave you was the trade barrier. So how does the international system has some conditions that lead some of its actors, some of its members, the states themselves, to enact trade barriers. So using the international system has been prominent in studies of international relations in the second half of the 20th century. Some scholars are still following this approach today. And it has some benefits. For starters, it offers us a more comprehensive view of the system, of the phenomena that we're talking about. It allows us to account for all the possible interactions within the system. So again, coming back to my example about trade barriers, it can provide us an explanation, not just for why one country sets the trade barriers versus another, but why all countries have incentives to set or don't have incentive to set in trade barriers while they operate within the system. We're looking at the entire system, and that's the second benefits we have here, which is providing a general explanation that can provide us not just trade barriers as an example. Why do coalitions form? All kinds of states, why do they form coalition within the international system? How can we explain different shifts in power? Why does one state supposed to be, what does the power reside in one side of the system over a central number of years, and then it changes to a different area? What are the conditions that the system has that leads to that? Now, one of the things that we do when we study the system level of analysis is we minimize the differences between the different actors, between the states, and we view all actors, all states within the international system as homogeneous. The benefit in this case is it allows us to study many more correlations within the states, because we see all states as the same. They're all actors within the state, within the system. So it's allowed us to identify and then study many more correlations that we are observing. The final benefit in this case, and that comes back to the explanation that I talked about on Tuesday, one of the important principles when we evaluate and build a theory is to build a simple framework, simple model. In this case, this is parsimony. So by using the system level of analysis, we can build a relatively manageable models which provide a very simple and in many cases intuitive explanations to different phenomena. It also has advantage in the sense of it doesn't have a lot of methodological requirements when we do empirical testing, because a lot of the components of the model are going to be very homogeneous. So those are the benefits that this kind of approach offers us. And as I said, it was very, very common in the second half of the 20th century to study especially many of the relations in IR based on the system level of analysis. And actually next week when we start talking about the theories of realism and neorealism, you will see how that fits into this explanation. And also we'll be able to demonstrate some of the benefits in this case. But as you can probably guess, it's not just benefits, there's also costs. Any explanation in focusing on the system underplays the different components, in this case, the nation state. And so the outcomes are driven in a more deterministic fashion, driven by the system, instead of focusing on the role of those different components. How do nation states, how does their behavior, their autonomy, their independence, and their actions drive different outcomes? We're actually focusing on the system, and we're minimizing the actions of the states themselves. So again, coming back to the example of trade barriers, the reason that we have trade barriers between systems is a function of the system itself and not based on the behavior of certain states. Because that we want to view the components of the system, again, the states in this case, as relatively homogeneous, that requires, and that sets some limitation on analysis in this case, there's going to be a greater degree of uniformity in the behaviors of the state. So there's no room for diversity in how states behave in the international system according to this approach. And as an example, we'll talk about realism next week, but one of the most basic assumptions based on the fact that realism is a system level theory is that all members of the system, the states, all operate with one goal in mind. That's realism. They want to follow their interests as defined by power. So essentially what realism argues is that all states have one interest in mind, and that's to extend power as much as possible. On some cases, it's very much correct. On some cases, maybe not. And that's why it sets some limitations on analysis in this case. Now, this is from Singer's piece itself. And what he essentially argues here when he talks about the limitation or the cost of following this approach is that when we downplay or pay less attention to the variation between the different internal components, again, the states here, what we tend is to look at states from what's called the black box or billiard ball concept. So all states are the same. We don't care what happened inside those states. We view their behavior as similar. We view all of them as similar. And that's what this approach offers us. Again, it has the benefits of simplicity, general explanations. It has the cost in terms of some of these requirements and underplaying some of the specific elements. Okay, so that's the system level of analysis. And now I want to talk about the nation level of analysis, the nation state level of analysis. This is the other option when we think about different level of analysis. looks more closely at the states themselves, the inner workings and how that drives their behavior. So for example, if we look at this figure that we have here, this picture that we have here, we can think about how is the structure of the government affects the behavior of those states in the international system. For example, so the top picture is the British Parliament. The structure of the government is very different from the other two pictures we have here. So the British government is a majority coalition government, very different from the American presidential system, and the fact that the American system has separation of powers, and the Congress has one power, and the president has power. And those are the things, according to the nation states level of analysis, that affect their behavior on the international scale. And the last one here is the Great Hall of the People in China. Again, a different state has a different structure of its government. And according to this level of analysis, that might be one of the important drivers of its behavior on international politics. So the nation state level of analysis is one of the prominent approaches today. A lot of these scholars are following this kind of this view of the international system. Let's talk benefits. The clearest advantage, and is the exact opposite of the system approach, is there's a lot more, we account for a lot more variation between the actors. So we can explain those events based on different actors. So it's not just why do states set trade barriers against other states. It's why let's think about it, like why some types of states, why democracies or why non-democracies are more likely to set trade barriers versus others. So this allows us to account for a lot more variation that requires to conduct a much more in-depth study of the states, but we still can derive general explanations, because instead of looking at states, it's just all states are the same, and then coming back to the example that we'll probably carry it on for the next 10 minutes or so of trade barriers, not why states enact policies of trade barriers. We can think about different types of states. So why do democracies or non-democracies are more likely to set trade barriers? So we're providing a general explanation of some regimes, in this case democracies or non-democracies, why do they enact some policy, but we do account for the internal variation between those states. Another benefit that we have from this case is that we can actually derive multiple different explanations based on multiple factors that can lead to outcomes. So trade barriers is not just one set of factors that lead to it, which is more prevalent in the international system. It can be different elements within the states, within those variations within states that lead to outcomes. That can be public opinion, that can be electoral institution, that can be all kinds of things within the foreign policy process. So there's multiple factors that can lead to outcomes. So that's some of the benefits we have from the nation states level of analysis. What are the costs? So on the one hand, we have the benefits of a lot more variations, but if we think about our goal of scientists to derive general explanations, by focusing more on those variations of the components, it limits our ability to compare actors. So I gave in the picture the example of the Great Britain and the United States and China. Let's stay with the democracies for a minute. If we want to understand why do democratic countries set barriers under some conditions, we can think about democratic countries, because democratic countries are one level in the nation state level of analysis of states. We're not looking at states overall, we're looking at democratic countries. But there's also a lot of variation between democracies, because in terms of the structure of government, there's a lot of differences between the British system and the American system. I talked about that. Let's add in a few more democracies. So the French system is also very different from these two. They have both a government with a prime minister and a president. And I'll also add my backyard state of Israel, which has a coalition-based government led by a prime minister. There's a lot of differences within, in this case, this factor is the structure of the government within those democratic countries. So how can we actually compare? We want to think about why do democratic states set trade barriers? Can we compare Israel, France, Britain, and the United States? there is some limitation when we use this level of analysis. Another potential limitation in this case is that we over-rely on the differences instead of trying to find maybe common aspects of those actors. So what are the common aspects of democracies? We may be over-relying on the differences between the government structure between the different democracies that I mentioned and use that as part of our explanation. Again, it comes back to the first limitation in this case is the problems of making comparison under certain conditions. The last one is that when we use the nation-state level of analysis, it's not always clear whether the behavior that we are observing in the international state, again, the example of trade barriers, is this a function of a goal-oriented behavior? So is this was some objective of the government that led eventually to this behavior? Or is it actually just a behavior that is the function of a compromise of different internal conflicts within the state? So in the case of the United States, so maybe the Congress pushed in one direction and the president and the executive branch pushed in another direction, and the compromise eventually was to set some trade barriers. So it is a limitation on the behavior of the state because it's not necessarily that the objective was, in this case, trade barriers maybe is not a very good policy, but you can think about maybe more positive policies. But regardless of the policy, the idea is that whether the behavior was intended to pursue this goal, whether it was just a compromise between different agendas of different actors. So that's a limitation in this case. Overall, Singer promotes a view that places more emphasis and provides more support for the nation-state level of analysis, in spite of those cost limitations. He has some reasons that he talks about the need to attest to provide more attention to the process that leads to those adoption of those specific goals in the international context. The need to account for internal effects, whether it is, again, different institution, whether it is election, whether it is public opinion. So how those factors also impact the behavior of the state, the external factors that are also in play. Overall, this provides a much more rich and satisfactory explanation to state behaviors. If you want to come back one more time, and I hope it's the last time, to the example of trade barriers. So by using the nation-state level of analysis, we are potentially able to provide a much more satisfactory explanation to why that happens, or if you want to go into specific details, why do democracies less likely to enact trade barriers compared to using system level in order to explain that. So that's another one. At the same time, one of the costs that we pay that by adopting this level of analysis is that it requires a much more complex methodologies. And I'll come back again to the example that I talked about the different systems of government between the British and the American and the French in that matter. We have to, from an empirical standpoint, to account for the fact that the American system is based on the presidents along with the power of the Congress also in some of the cases. And the British government is a little bit different. So I have to account for that from an empirical standpoint. So it requires a much more complex methodologies in order to properly test and evaluate those theories. So that's one of the costs we pay, again, in the nation-state level of analysis, and Singer accounts for that, but he still promotes the nation-state as much more possible explanation. Now, finally, in this context, one of the last things that Singer talks about is he hints at the possibility of another level of analysis, which today, since the paper was published over 40 years ago, 50 years ago, we can positively be certain that this level, of course, exists, and that's individual leaders. The idea behind the individual leaders level of analysis is to answer the question, is it possible that states' behavior in international system is not just, or maybe it's not a function of objective factors? Because if we think about the system level or the nation-state level, it's a lot of objective factors, okay? The condition between states, different factors within the states, they're all objective. On the other hand, when we focus about the leaders, then this is a much more individual perceptual idea. So how does the perception, for that example, how does the threat perception of the leader will impact the behavior of the state in different conditions? So we can think about those different leaders we have here. So we have Teddy Roosevelt on one hand, And the next guy that we have here in black and white is Mao, that was controlled China from the late 1940s all the way through the 1970s. The three gentlemen sitting together on top are another member of the Roosevelt clan in this case, FDR, along with Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England, of Great Britain, and Joseph Stalin, the head of the Soviet Union at the time, and a very funny reference for 90s comedies. And the last two gentlemen here, if you're not familiar with them, this is Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin from Israel. He was Israeli Prime Minister, and he was assassinated in 1995. And he's sharing a cigarette with King Hussein from Jordan, who also passed away a few years ago. So again, all those individual different leaders, what this level of analysis talks about, and we'll talk about it a lot more in detail when we get to the individual level, is the question, is it possible that the perception, the way that they perceive threats from their neighbors, whatever the neighbor is, whatever the threat is, will also affect the way that they behave as leaders of a state? And that also points for the potential difficulty with this level of analysis, and that's again measurement. How do we measure the perception of leaders? How do we distinguish or find the commonalities between the perception of FDR along with Mao and Stalin in this case? There may be some things which are different. There may be some, for sure there are things that are different, and maybe some things are the same. But again, how do we account for that? So that's one of the difficulties in this level of analysis. Okay, let's wrap up the discussion about levels of analysis and Singer's work with what he did as kind of a summary of his ideas. And we think about it, again, for our discussion in the context of the basics of theory construction and looking at those two levels, not talking about the individual one, we're talking about the system and the nation state. So one element that we had was description. So on the one hand, the system level of analysis offers a very much comprehensive view of the system and the potential explanation for whatever phenomenon we're talking about. On the other hand, the nation state offers a much more depth and details. For the element of explanation, as I've already said, Singer views the state level as much stronger, provides mostly because it's based on this in-depth analysis of the components of the system. It also addresses the process of how our behavior, trade barriers, wars, coalition, power structures. So that's the outcome. How does the outcome is based on the process, and the state level of analysis offers a lot more details. In terms of prediction, he is not very clear. He doesn't provide a clear distinction here, because we have to think about it, and that also is a hint to our next topic for today's lecture, and that's going to be theory versus practice. His argument is that scholars and policymakers will view those two different analyses and value different aspects of them. So scholars, because we want to derive general theories to explain phenomena in our own areas of international relations, we want to probably more likely to value the system level of analysis, because that provides us the framework to provide those general explanations. On the other hand, policymakers want to know why did China in Vietnam enact trade barriers over the last 10 years. So they're looking at much more state level, lower level of analysis. So that's the differences in this case. And that's one of the issues that he raises. One way to illustrate how two different levels of analysis can explain actually pretty much the same phenomena, but lead to different implications or different outcomes is, let's think about a war between two big countries. So if we're thinking about two great powers collide, and that means that we're looking about it through the prism of the system level of analysis. According to that framework, what's most likely to happen is that the system is going to be a bipolar system. And that's how we characterize, according to some of the system level theories, the global international system during the Cold War. United States and the Soviet Union collided throughout the Cold War. We had a system which was bipolar, which each side of the system has its own polar. At the same time, we can also think about it in the context of the nation-state level of analysis. Two nation-states, relatively equal in their power and then in their resources, collide. And the outcome in this case is going to be a little bit different. It's not necessarily focusing on the system, but looking at how the states will behave. So it's more likely that each one of those nation-states will try to gather as many allies as possible. And that's pretty much what we had during the Cold War. Either the United States or the Soviet Union tried to enact those different dynamics of alliances, and that's an analysis based on the nation states themselves, not on the system. So that's the same kind of interaction between two states. We can explain them based on those two different frameworks. Okay, so on Tuesday and on the first half that I've talked about so far today, and for the remainder of the first half of the course, we're going to talk about a lot of different theories, but that raises a different question in this case. It's a question that maybe some of you are asking, and I'm sure some of you will think about at some point, is that why should we care about all those theories? What is those theories going to do for us in the real world? And that leads to a very large topic that talks about, do theories are applied in reality? Do policymakers, real politicians, or political officials, because we're talking about IR, but it can be true in any other context of study, but we're talking about IR. So do political officials actually use theory from IR to apply them in reality? So there's a couple of examples of historical events that were actually informed by IR theories. For example, the domino effect, which is very famous to the days of the Vietnam War. One of the partial explanations for why the United States placed such an emphasis on Vietnam during the Cold War was the domino effect logic. The domino effect argued on some level, and I'm not going to go into the details of the theoretical explanation, is that once Vietnam will fall, the rest of East Asia will fall to the hands of the communists, and then the Cold War is going to be in a much worse place than it is. And that, on some level, informed the policy of the American administration. Same thing we can think about. A much more recent war is the war in Iraq. A lot of it was based on some of the insights coming from the neoconservative school, which viewed the need to change the regimes of countries that represent a risk in order to make them friendly to the United States. And it's not, according to this theory, there was one of the ways to implement those kinds of policies is to use American military power. So the war in Iraq was also on some level built on some of those ideas. So there are some examples for that. But overall, from a more general perspective, we want to ask, how much does a theory inform policymaking? One way to test those questions is to talk to the policymakers themselves. We can talk about them, and there's research about it from the last 25 years or so. The general view is that academic research is valuable and is useful. However, when we go into a little bit more details, the view is that academic research is less useful when it's overly technical and overly complicated. And I want to go into those kinds of arguments now. In order to do that, I'm going to use a paper by Avey and Desch from 2014. And this paper has been one in a series of studies that they did on this topic, and it actually came out in the book, I think, last year, talking about this, those links between theories in international relations and how much they are applied by policymakers. What they did in this specific studies, they surveyed policymakers, 234 members, senior members of the national security functions that worked for both George Bush Sr., Clinton, and George W. Bush. They asked them different questions about the usefulness, their use of the theories, how much they value them, how much they actually use them. And the way that I'm going to address all those points in the discussion now is by showing you a lot of the results with the graphical results that they had, and then we can talk a little bit more details on what exactly that means. So we'll begin with the very basics. How much are they aware of those different theories? So some of the theories here you maybe heard of, some of them I've talked a little bit about. We'll talk more about some of them in the future. But we can see that a theory such as mutual assured destruction, right here in the middle, and I've mentioned the MAD idea during the Cold War, that both of the superpowers had the capability to actually to respond even after being attacked once. So this was a very familiar theory for policymakers. And it makes sense because if you think about when this data was collected, it was collected by members who were members of the national security teams in the administration in the late 1980s, the early 1990s. So that was right after the Cold War. So this theory was very popular. The Clash of Civilization is another theory that came out in the 1990s, which was intended to explain the global system after the Cold War as the clash between the Western civilization and the Islamic civilization. It got a lot of pushback since then. But again, you can see the level of knowledge. So again, coming back to the first finding in this case is that policymakers are aware of many of the theories of IR. Personally, I'm a little concerned that not a lot of them talked about expected utility, which is one of the basic theories of classical economics, but that's beside the point. But that's one finding that we have. So they're aware of it. What do they actually think about it? So another question here is how useful those theories are for policy. And first, this is a more general view in terms of the different disciplines. So as you can see, the most prominent ones, and again, the most useful one as the bars on the left-hand side for each one of those different disciplines, are history and area studies, as well as international affairs. So a lot of policy is based on history, and that's what policymakers are looking for when they're looking for theories, as well as economics, even though, coming back to the previous slide, saying that economics is a very useful discipline, but very few of policymakers are aware of the basic principles of economics might be a little concerning. But again, that's beside the point. Coming back to our point, political science is not in a very good place when less than 50% see it as somewhat useful and less than 20%, or almost 20%, I'm sorry, see it as not useful. So those are some of the views of those policymakers. Let's go back to the specific theories within IR and see how they are viewed. So these are the different theories, just like I had in the first slide, in the first figure. So how useful is the MAD theory that so many of the policymakers are aware of? Somewhere in between. Not sure that the somewhat useful, the bar here is very representative because you can see all of them is pretty much the same. You can look at the two polar axes of very useful or not very useful and see that for the vast majority, many of those theories are not very useful in the eyes of policymakers. And one of the problems here, we can see it very clearly in this figure, is that a lot of the academic research on IR theories uses complicated, rigorous methodologies as part of our testing protocols. Because when we want to test a theory, just like I said, we need to follow a very strict, clear set of rules in order to follow the scientific method. So our methodologies are usually very complicated. And that serves as a problem for policymakers. Because if we look at this figure, the most useful methodologies according to policymakers is area studies over here, historical case studies, and contemporary case studies. And I talked about case studies on Tuesday, telling you that this is very useful methodology, but the problem is it does not allow us to derive too much of a general explanation. And as scholars, we are mostly focused on deriving general explanations, so we don't deal that much with case studies. But policymakers view case studies because they want specific explanation to specific phenomena in this case. So they prefer those methodologies. So you can see the contrast here between what policymakers are looking for and what academics are mostly engaging in. A lot of the academic research, especially in IR, has been using quantitative analysis. And quantitative analysis in the eyes of policymakers, almost a quarter of them view it as not very useful. It's overly technical, and in many cases, they don't think that it provides them explanations to the questions that they're asking. So that's part of the problem. That's one important part of this problem of why policymakers do not view a lot of the research that is being done in IR as useful. That's another way to look at the gap or the contrast between what is valued by policymakers and what is valued actually by academics. What you see here is actually a breakdown of the area studies, but as you can see is the different areas of the different regions of the world, how much they are studied and how much do policymakers think they should be studied and how much they want to know about those areas. So policymakers, in this case, the most right-hand bar represents the policymakers' value for East Asia is very, very high, but the scholars' focus, here is the left-hand bar, is very, very low. Because scholars are trying to derive, again, general explanation about phenomenon that's not focusing on the Middle East or East Asia in this case. The policymakers want to understand different events that happen in the Middle East or East Asia, and that's what they're looking for in their interactions with social scientists, in political scientists for that matter. So that's another way to look at those differences. The last two figures in this case are mostly related to how policymakers, they don't see a lot that, let me rephrase that. They view IR theories and theories from political science overall as less useful, but it's not that they're not using them. So how actually they are using those theories? So this is some of the examples. This is a more general question about social science, but of course we are part of it. So the pie chart on the left-hand side represents how policymakers relate those social science theories to their work. And in the vast majority of cases, almost 70%, it represents actually intellectual background. So it provides them the foundations for understanding what they want to do. And very, very rarely, it actually applies directly. And this is about 12% according to this sample of policymakers. And how many times are they actually using that? So as you can see, it's about a breakdown of 25% for a few times a month or a few times a week, and not very much a daily usage of those social science theories in actual policymaking. And the last slide we have here for this issue is how do policymakers themselves see the place of scholars? So this is actually not a very easy to read slide because the way that it's still here, but the vast majority of them, almost 90%, see the role of scholars as informal advisors or creators of information, which again, providing background information to different policy questions. But when you talk about direct involvement in policymaking, it's hard to make this bar even smaller. So less than 10% think that scholars should be involved in policymaking. That's how scholars see the role, and this data actually represents this theory versus practice debate. All right, before I move on to the last set of points I want to make for today, I will stop today to provide you with the attendance word for today. The attendance word for today is responsible. Again, responsible is the attendance word. When you're done with the lecture, make sure you go to the Google form and record your information with the relevant attendance word for today, right? Good. So we said that there's a lot of gap between what most of scholars are looking for in their studies and what policymakers want to gain from scholars. So we as scholars did not just sit on our hand and did nothing facing those kinds of gaps. And some research has shown us in ways to actually accommodate those differences. So this is a study by Byman and Cronin from a couple of years ago. And they address those questions of how can we make actually one of this, what can we do to make IR research relevant? And they offer some suggestions. First is designing and making research which is practical and leads to useful recommendations. So this is recommendations that policymakers can actually employ on some form when they implement policymaking. They recommend to, instead of trying to provide very general questions to those puzzles, instead of providing general answers to those questions, we want to focus and provide information that is going to clarify specific situations. So there's some policy debates which may lack information, and that's exactly where policymakers, where scholars can step in, provide this background information, which again is going to make everything much clearer. The last point is one of the most sensitive and important ones. Research that scholars provide needs to be timely. If I'm working on a research today that explains the events that are happening in East Asia, but I'm only able to publish it and provide it to policymakers in 3 years from now, it's not useful to policymakers. They're going to need answers as soon as possible. And part of the problem for that is a structural problem related to the academic world, which I'm not going to go into, but that's the main recommendation and their main suggestion. Now, they also provide specific and concrete steps in order to bridge that gap between policy and theory. First is the need of scholars and researchers to establish a wide network of connections and personal connections with people within the policymaking circle. They need to use the large bureaucracy which drives policymaking in order to inject their research wherever possible. And one of the ways that they can do that is that not necessarily to publish their research in a 10,000 word article in an academic journal, but instead focus on non-academic outlets and provide much more concise and clear reports, which are, again, in most cases, they're shorter because they answer those specific questions. It's not very likely that the Secretary of State is reading the American Political Science Review, an academic journal. It's more likely that he's going to read, or a member of his staff is going to read Foreign Affairs or Foreign Policy, which are two policy-related outlets. They are semi-academic on some level. So by providing our research or some of the insights from our research into those kinds of outlets, it's more likely we'll be able to actually contribute to policymaking. If I'm a researcher of East Asia and I have research interesting related to questions that are happening now, if I've already established personal connections with members of the policymaking circles, I'm able to provide that person some insights from my work, which may be useful for policymaking. But that's only going to be possible if we're going to have this personal connection, because then it's going to allow me to provide to him those kinds of evidence, those kinds of findings in a timely manner. So this is an important part of this. Now, the researchers also talked about specific situation in which the input from academic research is most likely to be relevant and accepted. This includes conditions such as discontinuous events such as the Arab Spring or when the Soviet Union collapsed in the late 1980s. Those are situations in which there's a lot of challenge to government knowledge, and that's exactly can be the opening for experts on those kinds of issues, expert scholars, to provide that information. Similarly, when there's kind of failures for existing policies, such as the rise of insurgency in Iraq after 2004, and these are the places when experts in insurgency, experts in those kinds of warfare can provide the relative information that's going to support thinking about new policy, revising the existing policy, and again, providing this foundational understanding for how to address those different situations. And similar to that, that's the unexpected decisions. Background knowledge, for example, the decision to militarily intervene in Somalia. If the members of the policymaking circles have no much knowledge about the political, the social, the economic conditions in Somalia, the strategic conditions in that part of Africa, that's exactly the place where academic scholars can provide this background knowledge, and again, on some level, drive and affect the policy-making process. One more point that Byman and Croning are focusing on is talking to the scholars themselves, to the academics themselves, and telling them what we need to do as scholars is to rescale or to temper our expectation, mostly thinking about what exactly is being relevant. Because if my goal as an academic is to drive policy, the likelihood is not very, very high. Why? Because mostly policy is decided by a very senior official. And even if I'm able to establish connections and actually influence those officials, I'm more likely to establish connections with more junior officials in the policymaking circles. And those junior officials usually do not have that much of an impact when it comes to the elite policymakers and who are the ones who set the policy. So again, we have to understand what's the likelihood that we actually will be able to shape the policy and work on that. So it's much more likely that we can be effective by influencing the deliberation process, by providing this background, this foundational information about the different issues at stake. Academic research can provide a lot more to the policymaking process. They also mention, not to forget, why would policymakers view those kinds of things, and where is the greatest value that policymakers see with academic research? And they talk about the possibility to use academic research as offering contrarian arguments to accepted view. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, there may have been some accepted view of the government, but policymakers can use a lot of the knowledge that exists in academic circles on those kinds of topics and offer different arguments that's going to expand the debate. Another example in this case we can think about is the democratic peace theory, which I told you, I've mentioned it a couple of times already on Tuesday and today, and we're gonna spend a lot more time about it later in the semester. But the democratic peace theory first came to be published in academic circles in the late 1980s. Slowly, it crept into the policy process by, again, those kinds of relationships and having a lot more concise arguments. It was part of the debate in the 1990s, the mid-1990s. It was actually a pretty not insignificant part of the debate before the 1996 elections. And it was a substantial part also of the logic that led the freedom agenda by President George W. Bush. Again, the idea of, and again, this is a very loose interpretation of that, but the democratic peace theory argues that two democracies are not likely to settle their disputes by using force. So we're going to go into Iraq and change the regime to a democratic regime in order to minimize the likelihood of conflict with them. Again, it's a very loose way to view that, but that's one way in which this theory came into the policy process and actually had an effect. Okay, so that's where I'm ending the discussion about our topic, but don't close the lecture yet, please. Give me a few more minutes. First of all, a few more readings. I highly do recommend to you something which I came across over the last couple of days, to go into this post by Professor Hendricks from the University of Denver. He talks about the idea of policy relevance for academic research and how we need to think about it. That's a little bit, it's based on the discussion that I had from the AV and DASH papers, but gives you a little different interpretation. I highly recommend to read that. It's a very short blog post, and there's other research if you're interested in. Okay, so as I promised on Tuesday, if I'll have some interesting insights or some issues I want to talk about related to the first task, I'm gonna provide you some information. So here I'm gonna follow that promise as well. First of all, I have 6 people that did not complete the survey. If for some reason you did not complete the survey, you have a good reason for that, please contact me so we can see exactly what was the problem. And as you know, what we like to do is to play with the data. So I played with the data a little bit. Most of you have stated that did not take an online class, and that may have been, that could be the true, I don't know. I'm gonna take your word for that, but it could be also my way of framing the question, because I'm assuming that a lot of you were forced to take online classes last spring semester when the university shifted to online teaching, online classes. So that's part of it, but that's just my bad on the bad phrasing of the question. Overall, it seems that you have a relatively positive view of online classes. It's not that we have a choice. This course is going to be online. It's not going to change, but it's good to know that you are overall viewing it as in a positive manner. I do not ignore this 20%, and I'm going to talk about it in a few seconds also. Okay, so don't worry about that. I understand that a lot of you prefer the in-person method, the more personal connection, but this is just not possible at the moment. A little bit more, this is a very nice bell curve shape of your views in terms of how concerned are you, focusing on around the 50%. Some of you are concerned. It's good to know that you are taking this class seriously, and you have some concerns about that, but that's how that looks. More importantly, I ask you more specifically about to rank your concern for this semester. And this is actually a good figure to show you something else that I want you to be aware of for this entire semester. When you see results, when you see data, understand exactly what the data means. In this case, the results actually are the opposite, because if you remember, the question asks you to rank what is the highest concern to the lowest concern. So if you have a number 1 for a concern, that means it's the thing that you worry about the most. So in this case, if you want to interpret this specific figure, lower values on these mean concerns axis here represent things you're more concerned about. So you're mostly concerned about online classes, which is fair, and missing some on the college experience, which again, it sucks, it's a bummer, but there really is nothing we can do about it right now. I'm a little worried that you see social distancing as not very much important, and I hope you will think about it a little bit more and take this under consideration for the remainder of the year. The last point, I'm sure that maybe some of you had thought that I will not read, but I did read your text comments, all of them actually. And I want to give you some pointers regarding to some of the main things that I saw in those comments. Again, I will be able to help with some. I won't be able to help with others, but I do take this seriously, as I promised you when I talked about this task from the start. Some of you talked about the need for personal connection. Again, there's not much I can do about that. The best suggestion I have for that is come join me in office hours. It's not happy hours. We do not drink. You're not allowed to drink. But we can do as much personal connection as we can during those office hours. Even if you don't have specific question, you just want to understand some things in more general, you're more than happy to join me in office hours for your relevant times. In terms of feedback, some of you have raised concerns about the fact that they cannot get immediate feedback. Again, I understand that. I don't have a perfect solution for that. The only solution I have is you can fire up an email to me right after you have some question. Even if you are during the lecture and you want to question, ask something, you can do that. Unfortunately, we're not in class. I cannot answer the question right away. So we'll try to manage that. There's not much we can do in terms of solving it all together. If you have any kind of personal issues that are a problem to you, I'm not very likely to solve them to you. I can try to do the best I can to try and help you. If those are just concerns you have, some pressing concerns you have from this semester overall, I can do my best and I can do what I can do to make this course less of a burden to you during this semester, okay? There's some questions about extra credit. I don't have it at the moment. I do think it's probably gonna happen at some point in the future of the semester, but I don't wanna promise anything. So once I'll have that, I'll let you know. The most pressing matter that a lot of you have mentioned is the idea of making sure you're organized, you're not missing deadlines, you're not missing readings, that some of the messages for your other courses are in Canada, some of them are on Blackboard and eCampus. And so here I have some practical solutions. I'm only using eCampus. Everything that I'm using is only gonna be on eCampus. So you're not gonna get anything from me on campus, I can promise you that now. Other thing, in terms of not missing due dates or something of this family of concerns, I will edit the syllabuses for both sections and add the due dates for all the different tasks and the midterm task, and you already have the date for the final task, but I will add those dates to the syllabus so you will have that, and then it's going to be much more organized for you in terms of knowing when you have to submit anything. Now, for the other task, you still did not get, I did not send the links for that, but once we get closer to each one of those tasks, you're going to get the link and you're going to have on the syllabi the due date to submit that. So that's one more thing that I can do and try and help you. So just really use the syllabus and follow the deadlines of the syllabus and the dates overall in order to do that. Try to read before class based on what you have on the syllabus. Last thing is also one thing that's related to access to class material, which I got some comments about. If you're not, I gave you the links on the okay, so sorry for this stopping the recording. I just wanted to open one syllabi so I can help you with that. In terms of access to the material, so on your syllabi, you have those blue links. Those blue links will usually gonna send you to specific pages where the articles are. Now, if you're on the university premises, you're able to, and I'm just gonna take as an example, one link so we can see that. I just want to make sure that we are all watching the same screen. Here it is. So this is where you get when you press the link. If you're on the university premises, once you press this, you're going to get the article, right? So that's the article, and that's the easiest way. And if you're not on the university premises, then this access with just pressing the PDF might not be possible. So my recommendation and the best way to do that is just copy the name of the article, open it on Google Scholar. Once the results come up, you have this link here, which is PDF. This is JSTOR. This is just a publishing company. And when you press that, in most cases, you will have direct access to the article. Now, if both of these methods do not work, and let me come back just one more time here. There you go. If none of these methods work, what you can do is get the access to the article through the university library. So you go into the library website, you log into what's called My Library, which are UIN and your password. And then in the search, just write in the name of the paper, just like I had here, this rational explanations of war, and then it's going to give you the results. And there is the full text link. Press the full text link. It's going to give you access to the article. So if there's different ways to access the material, whether you are on the university premises, whether you're back home, or whether you're not even in College Station or in Texas. So if you have any problems and you're still unable to access your material, let me know. I will try and help. That's it. It was a little bit longer maybe than we had before. I really wanted to address your main concerns regarding this semester. If you have any questions, you are more than welcome to send them to me. And I will see you all next week. Have a nice weekend. Stay safe. Make sure you wear a mask when you walk around outside. And I will see you on Tuesday. Bye, everyone.